The kingdom of Erinder was dying. Once a land of lush forests, golden fields, and rivers that shimmered like liquid silver, it now lay in ruin. The skies were perpetually gray, choked with ash from the burning villages that dotted the landscape. The Crimson Throne, a symbol of Erinder's strength and unity, was under siege. The queen, Liriel sat in her crumbling palace, her once vibrant emerald eyes now dull with despair. Her enemies, the Kralzar, a race of monstrous beings from the northern wastes, had swept across the land like a plague. Their leader, Vorgoth the Unmaker, had sworn to eradicate the royal bloodline. Liriel's husband, King Alden, had fallen in battle, and her armies were scattered. Now, only one hope remained, her infant son, Prince Kael, the last heir to the Crimson Throne. But the Kralzar were closing in. The palace walls trembled under the force of their war machines, and the air was thick with the stench of smoke and blood. Liriel knew she could not save her son alone. She needed someone who could slip past the enemy lines, someone who could survive the treacherous journey to the hidden sanctuary of Erinder's last hope. She needed a mercenary. In the shadowed alleys of Port Vera, the last free city in Erinder, a human mercenary named Garrick Hale sat in a dimly lit tavern. His reputation was well known, a man who could survive anything, kill anyone, and disappear without a trace. He was tall, with a rugged face marked by a jagged scar running from his left temple to his jawline. His eyes, a cold steel gray, betrayed no emotion. Garrick was nursing a tankard of ale when a hooded figure approached him. The figure dropped a heavy pouch of gold coins on the table and slid a sealed letter toward him. Garrick raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He broke the seal and read the letter, his expression unreadable. To Garrick Hale. I am Queen Liriel of Erinder. My kingdom is lost, but my son, the heir to the Crimson Throne, must survive. I offer you 10 times the gold in this pouch if you can deliver him to the sanctuary of Erinder's last hope. Time is short. Come to the palace before the dawn, or all is lost. Garrick pocketed the gold and stood. He had no love for kings or queens, but gold was gold. And something about the queen's plea stirred a long-buried part of him, a part that remembered what it was like to fight for something more than coin. The journey to the palace was perilous. Garrick moved like a shadow, avoiding patrols of Kralzar warriors and their monstrous war beasts. He scaled the palace walls under the cover of darkness, slipping past guards and traps with ease. When he finally reached the queen's chambers, he found her standing by a cradle, her face pale but resolute. You came, she said, her voice trembling. I came for the gold, Garrick replied bluntly. But I'll get your son to safety. That's what you're paying me for. Liriel nodded, tears streaming down her face. She lifted the infant prince from the cradle and handed him to Garrick. The baby was swaddled in a crimson blanket, his tiny face peaceful despite the chaos around him. His name is Kael, Liriel said. He is the future of Erinder. Protect him with your life. Garrick nodded, slinging the baby across his chest in a makeshift sling. He turned to leave, but Liriel grabbed his arm. There is one more thing, she said, handing him a small, intricately carved amulet. This is the amulet of Erinder. It holds the power to unlock the sanctuary. Without it, you cannot enter. Garrick took the amulet and tucked it into his belt. I'll get him there, he said. But you should know, I'm not a hero. I'm just a man who's good at staying alive. Liriel smiled faintly. That's all I need. As Garrick disappeared into the night, Liriel turned to face the doors of her chamber. The Kralzar were coming. She would not let them take her without a fight. Garrick moved swiftly through the ruins of the palace, the infant prince cradled against his chest. The sounds of battle echoed around him, the clash of steel, the roar of flames, the screams of the dying. He kept to the shadows, his movements silent and precise. But the Kralzar were relentless. As Garrick approached the palace gates, he was ambushed by a group of their warriors. They were massive, their bodies covered in thick, black armor, their eyes glowing with a malevolent red light. Garrick drew his twin daggers and fought with a ferocity that surprised even himself. He moved like a whirlwind, his blades cutting through the enemy with deadly precision. When the last warrior fell, Garrick paused to catch his breath. The baby, miraculously, had not made a sound. Garrick adjusted the sling and pressed on. The journey to the sanctuary would take them through the Blackwood Forest, a place shrouded in legend and fear. It was said that the forest was cursed, home to creatures that preyed on the unwary. Garrick had no choice but to take the risk. The main roads were crawling with Kralzar patrols, and time was running out. As they entered the forest, the air grew cold and heavy. The trees loomed overhead, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sky. Garrick's senses were on high alert. He could feel the weight of unseen eyes watching him. Hours passed, and the forest seemed to stretch on forever. Just as Garrick began to wonder if they were lost, he heard a low growl. He turned to see a massive wolf-like creature emerge from the shadows. Its fur was black as night, its eyes glowing with an eerie green light. Garrick tightened his grip on his daggers, but before he could strike, a voice called out. "Wait! Don't hurt him." A young woman stepped into view. She was dressed in simple robes, her dark hair braided down her back. Her eyes were kind, but there was a fierceness in them that reminded Garrick of the Queen. "Who are you?" Garrick demanded, keeping his daggers raised. "My name is Elara," the woman said. "I'm a healer. This is my companion, Shadow. He won't harm you." Garrick glanced at the wolf, which had lowered itself to the ground, its eyes still fixed on him. "What are you doing out here?" he asked. "I was sent to find you," Elara replied. "The Queen's messenger reached me before the palace fell. She asked me to help you on your journey." Garrick hesitated. He didn't trust easily, but he couldn't afford to turn down help. "Fine," he said. "But if you slow me down, I'll leave you behind." Elara nodded. "Understood." Together, they continued through the forest, Shadow leading the way. As they walked, Elara told Garrick about the sanctuary. It was hidden deep within the mountains of Solace, protected by ancient magic. Only those who carried the amulet of Irinder could enter. "But the Kralzar are searching for it," Elara warned. "They know the prince is the key to Irinder's survival. If they capture him, all is lost." Garrick glanced down at the sleeping infant. "I won't let that happen," he said. "Not while I'm still breathing." The journey through the Blackwood Forest was fraught with danger. The trees seemed to close in around them, their gnarled roots tripping their feet and their branches clawing at their faces. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant howl of some unseen beast. Garrick kept his guard up, his hand never far from the hilt of his dagger. Elara walked beside him, her staff glowing faintly with a soft, blue light. Shadow prowled ahead, his keen senses alert for any sign of danger. As they traveled, Garrick found himself growing more and more uneasy. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every shadow seemed to move, every whisper of the wind sounded like a voice. He glanced at Elara, but she seemed calm, her eyes focused on the path ahead. "How much farther?" Garrick asked, his voice low. "Not far," Elara replied. "We should reach the edge of the forest by nightfall." Garrick nodded, but his unease only grew. He had survived this long by trusting his instincts, and right now, they were screaming at him that something was wrong. As the sun began to set, they finally emerged from the forest. The mountains of Solace loomed in the distance, their peaks shrouded in mist. Garrick felt a small measure of relief. They were close now. Just a little farther, and they would reach the sanctuary. But as they made camp for the night, Garrick's suspicions were confirmed. He awoke to the sound of voices, low and urgent. He lay still, pretending to sleep, as he listened. "Are you sure about this?" It was Alara's voice, but it was cold, calculating. "Yes," replied a man's voice, deep and rough. "The Kralzar will pay a fortune for the prince. We'll be set for life." Garrick's blood ran cold. He had been betrayed. He slowly reached for his dagger, his mind racing. He was outnumbered, but he had the element of surprise. He would have to act quickly. As the voices grew closer, Garrick sprang into action. He rolled to his feet, his dagger flashing in the firelight. Alara and the man, a burly, scarred mercenary, froze in shock. Garrick didn't hesitate. He lunged at the man, his blade slicing through the air. The man barely had time to raise his sword before Garrick's dagger found his throat. Alara screamed, her staff glowing with a bright, blinding light. Garrick shielded his eyes, but the light was too intense. He stumbled back, disoriented. When his vision cleared, Alara was gone, and so was the prince. Garrick cursed, his heart pounding. He had been a fool to trust her. Now, he had to find her before it was too late. Garrick moved quickly, his senses sharp and his mind focused. He followed Alara's trail through the rocky terrain, his anger fueling his determination. He had been betrayed, and he would make her pay. The trail led him to a narrow canyon, its walls towering high above him. The ground was littered with loose rocks and gravel, making the going treacherous. Garrick pressed on, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. As he rounded a bend, he saw her. Alara was standing at the edge of a cliff, the prince cradled in her arms. She turned to face him, her expression cold and unreadable. "You shouldn't have followed me," she said, her voice calm. Garrick stepped closer, his dagger in hand. "Give me the boy," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Alara shook her head. "I can't do that. The Kralzar will pay handsomely for him. With that gold, I can start a new life, far away from this war." Garrick's grip tightened on his dagger. "You're a fool if you think they'll let you live. They'll kill you the moment they have the prince." Alara's eyes flickered with doubt, but she quickly masked it. "You don't understand," she said. "I have no choice. This is my only chance." Garrick took another step forward. "There's always a choice," he said. "You can still do the right thing." For a moment, Alara hesitated. Then, with a cry of frustration, she turned and hurled the prince over the edge of the cliff. Garrick's heart stopped. Without thinking, he lunged forward, diving over the edge after the falling infant. The wind rushed past him as he plummeted toward the ground, his eyes locked on the tiny bundle in his arms. He twisted his body, shielding the prince with his own as they hit the ground with a bone-jarring impact. Pain exploded through Garrick's body, but he forced himself to his feet, clutching the prince to his chest. The baby was crying, but he was alive. Garrick looked up, his eyes blazing with fury. Alara was gone. Garrick's body was battered and broken, but he refused to stop. He cradled the prince in his arms, his steps slow and unsteady as he made his way toward the mountains of Solace. The sanctuary was close now. He could feel it. As he climbed the steep, rocky path, Garrick's mind wandered. He thought of the queen, of her desperate plea for help. He thought of Alara, and the betrayal that still burned in his chest. And he thought of the prince, the tiny life he now held in his hands. For the first time in years, Garrick felt something other than the cold, empty void that had consumed him. He felt purpose. Finally, he reached the entrance to the sanctuary. It was a massive stone door, carved with intricate runes and symbols. Garrick pulled the amulet of Irinder from his belt and pressed it against the door. The runes glowed with a soft, golden light, and the door slowly creaked open. Inside, the air was cool and still. The sanctuary was a vast, cavernous chamber, its walls lined with ancient tapestries and statues. At the center of the room stood a pedestal, upon which rested a glowing crystal. Garrick approached it, his heart pounding. As he placed the prince on the pedestal, the crystal began to pulse with a bright, golden light. The air around them shimmered, and Garrick felt a wave of warmth wash over him. The prince's cries ceased, and he looked up at Garrick with wide, curious eyes. Garrick smiled faintly. "You're safe now," he said. "You're home." As the light faded, Garrick felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had done what he had set out to do. The prince was safe, and Irinder's last hope was secure. But Garrick knew his journey wasn't over. There was still a war to fight, and a queen to avenge. He looked down at the prince one last time, then turned and walked out of the sanctuary, his dagger in hand. The Kralzar would pay for what they had done. And Garrick would make sure of it.